Hello and welcome to today's webinar. If Congress overhauls Section 230 to make platforms more liable for user speech, what will change? My name is Ashley Johnson and I'm a policy analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Today we're discussing the current state of the debate over Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the law that protects online platforms from liability for user speech. Joining me today is Matthew Feeney, Director of the Cato Institute's Project on Emerging Technologies, Emma Lanzo, Director of the Center for Democracy and Technology's Free Expression Project, and Matt Perot, Director of Duke University Center on Science and Technology Policy. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome everyone watching the live stream online. Please feel free to ask our panelists questions at any time during the event. If you're watching at ITIF.org, you can use the Q&A form under the video. If you're watching on YouTube, please follow the link in the description. The debate over whether Section 230's liability shield for online platforms is too broad or whether it should even exist is not a new one. But over the past year, Americans' increased reliance on digital communications during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the spread of public health and election disinformation on social media, and social media's response to the January 6th attack on the Capitol have fueled calls for Section 230's reform. Some say Section 230 should remain as it is, and that changing our intermediary liability law isn't the way to solve the problems we might have with the internet. Others want to change it. However, the solution isn't as simple as make online platforms more liable for user speech and solve every problem everyone has with the internet. Increasing platform liability would come with serious consequences for competition, innovation, and free speech. At ITIF, we just published our 5-part report series on Section 230, which I wrote with our Vice President, Daniel Castro, and which covers the law's history, its impact, its problems, both real and imagined, and the potential for reform. At ITIF, we called for a 3-part reform. First, narrow the law slightly by establishing a good faith requirement to prevent bad actors from taking advantage of Section 230's liability shield. Second, to prevent nuisance lawsuits while raising the bar slightly for good actors, establish a voluntary safe harbor provision to limit financial liability for online services that adhere to standard industry measures for limiting illegal activity. And third, expand federal criminal laws around harmful forms of online activity so that these activities are included in Section 230's existing exception for federal criminal law. We know this is a conversation that is ongoing, so we also launched a podcast this week where my fellow policy analyst, Elise Dick, and I talked to Section 230 experts called Elise and Ashley Break the Internet, and I encourage you all to subscribe. So today we're going to hear from 3 experts on free speech and content moderation and related issues, and I want to focus on the current state of affairs regarding Section 230, starting with the attack on the Capitol and social media's response, which has greatly shaped the debate on Section 230 in 2021. Matthew Feeney, in January, you wrote about how you expect online extremism to dominate the Section 230 debate in the wake of the attack on the Capitol. What's your reaction to how the debate has shifted since then? What has changed and what hasn't? You're muted. Oh, you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me? Sorry. Okay, yes. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I think everyone, or most people paying attention to the debate on Section 230 anticipated that with Democrats moving into the White House and taking over Congress, that the conversation would shift. It's in broad strokes, I think it's fair to say that during the Trump administration, many of the concerns about 230 from the right were about big social media companies taking down too much content, and there were complaints from the political left that these companies weren't doing enough to address a range of concerns related to political extremism, harassment, cyberstalking, and other harms. And the insurrection at the Capitol, I think, made a conversation that was already going to shift much more clarified, especially because in the wake of the attack, there were steps taken by Google, Apple, and Amazon to target Parler, which was a social media company that branded itself as a free speech oasis. It was a meeting venue for a lot of Trump supporters. And it's certainly true that a lot of content associated with the attack on the Capitol was shared on that platform. So I think in the coming weeks and months and maybe even years, that will continue to be a focus of those who are concerned about the behavior of social media companies and how they deal with a lot of the content associated with that attack. And the kind of content I'm talking about aren't just the sharing of videos and anger, but also, of course, the calls to violence, as well as the spread of conspiracy theories. We're in this interesting moment because as Americans, we're very fortunate to enjoy probably the most robust free speech protections in the world. But nonetheless, most of the speech that we exchange is done via private platforms, which who have the right to moderate their own content. So I do think that political extremism will continue to motivate much of the conversation, at least from the political left. From the political right, I think we should still anticipate concerns about politically motivated bias. I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon.
So, as Matthew alluded to, following the attack on the Capitol, many social media platforms and other online services limited, as you mentioned, Parler's access, and also Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms banned or suspended Trump's accounts, which led to these increased accusations of political bias and censorship that you mentioned from the right. So turning over to Emma, what roadblocks might Congress run into if it tries to use Section 230 to enforce political neutrality on social media or to forbid platforms from removing political speech?
Right. Well, I think the biggest roadblock there would be the First Amendment. One of the biggest challenges, as Matthew was pointing out, is that a lot of the content at issue in so many of the discussions around disinformation or kind of concerns about radical political opinions and whether those might lead to offline violence is that so much of the speech is comfortably within the bounds of what is protected under the First Amendment. There are absolutely exceptions to First Amendment protection for things like incitement to imminent violence, or particular kinds of harassing content, or particular kinds of false information that are tied to things like fraud. But it's going to be difficult, if not totally impossible, for Congress to pass a sweeping law against disinformation or a sweeping law that says companies must ensure that no political discussion gets so extreme or so intense that some people end up also committing offline violence. Any kind of move from Congress around issues like incitement to violence would have to be narrowly tailored. They would have to kind of look really specifically at the Supreme Court precedent around what kind of limits Congress can put on speech, and to keep in mind that going at this kind of speech through intermediaries is not a way to escape the First Amendment issues. Congress or the Supreme Court, in the few times it's looked at internet speech issues in cases like Reno versus ACLU or the Packingham versus United States case, it hasn't. There's not a ton of doctrine from the Supreme Court on internet speech issues, but what's there shows a really strong understanding that trying to control speech by controlling what intermediaries do raises so many of the same First Amendment questions. It's still government action that can limit people's ability to speech or limit their access to information. So I think Congress really needs to keep the First Amendment framework in mind as they're considering any of these issues around Section 230. And again, as Matthew mentioned, there's also the question of the First Amendment rights of the services themselves to set the sort of editorial standards of the kinds of content that they're willing to host. So that's not to say that there's nothing Congress can do, but there are some pretty significant cues from the First Amendment about needing responses from Congress to be narrow and focused and really aimed at solving a particular problem, addressing a particular compelling government interest, rather than a sort of amorphously framed, we need to do something about big tech, so we'll go after Section 230 to accomplish it. That's probably not focused in enough to be appropriate motivation for Congress.
And speaking of big tech, another issue that's become tangled up in the Section 230 debate is antitrust. So Matt Perot, how would you respond to the idea that Section 230 is a gift to big tech? How would repealing or limiting Section 230 impact large tech platforms? And how would it impact smaller ones or non-tech companies?
So first off, thanks so much, Ashley, for organizing this event and for including me, yet another Matt, to join the conversation. I really appreciate it. I'd love to get into the antitrust issues, but maybe before I do, I'd love to just kind of pick up on a couple of threads that that Emma touched on, because I think they're critical. As I think she said, obviously the First Amendment poses a real, narrows the options available to Congress in terms of what they might do to, what they might be able to do to regulate speech and harmful content particularly, but it's not an absolute bar. And so as she said, there are requirements around tailoring, but those aren't a total bar. Congress still has room to legislate in speech issues to some extent. And in a paper I wrote earlier in the fall, I called for Congress to consider two, in line, I think, Ashley, with the paper that that you said that that you've put out recently, in terms of thinking about an expanded role for federal criminal law to target some of the harms that we think of and associate with 230. Two that I pointed to specifically are voter suppression, where there currently is actually no federal criminal law on voter suppression. Again, for the reasons that Emma described, a law in this area would need to be very narrow. It would not solve all issues that we have in voting, but I think it actually could address some of the most harmful content that really does suppress the vote. And the second is the use of online tools to provoke riots. So the Anti-Riot Act was passed in the late 60s, is still on the books, has not been entirely struck down. There's a Fourth Circuit case on it that upheld components of the law, struck down other components. And I think we should think about modernizing that law with the realities of the First Amendment in mind, but using that kind of legal structure to target the use of platforms for harm. The question that you asked about was about whether Section 230 has benefited large platforms. Section 230 benefits any platform that has a user-generated content business model. So it's benefited big platforms like Facebook and Google. It benefits publishers, even though publishers have been critical of Section 230. It benefits News Corp when it wants to host online content, online comments. Or it benefits the New York Times when they want to have their wonderfully creative New York Times cooking community, for instance, where people can comment about various different recipes. I rely heavily on that community myself. And so it benefits a lot of different types of providers, and it benefits not just large providers, but also small providers. Companies like Facebook and Google, if Section 230 is repealed, will be able to bear the increased legal costs. They'll be able to make decisions about whether they actually want to continue with a user-generated content business model that will bring them into court more and require greater amounts of litigation fees, or whether they want to constrain the amount of content available, user content available on their platforms to minimize that legal risk. Smaller platforms won't be able to make that decision. The idea of a lawsuit that could potentially really threaten their business in a fundamental way. And so they probably, I think, are going to be in less of a position where they're able to make a decision and where they actually may be forced to re-architect their products so that they're no longer as focused on hosting user-generated content, because they need to avoid the possible litigation risk. So I actually think, despite the common rhetoric around it, that Section 230 protects the startup community and protects competition in the tech sector, and that we need to have some version of it to remain in order to have the most vibrant and competitive and innovative tech sector we can have.
So Matt, you mentioned the report that you wrote for the Day One Project, where you outlined a Section 230 reform agenda for the Biden administration. And since you brought it up, can you summarize some of your recommendations, maybe some of the ones that you didn't already mention?
Yeah, so I think the key one is the one that was consistent with the report that you guys wrote on modernizing federal criminal law for the digital age. And instead of looking to platforms to regulate speech and to design the rules of the road for figuring out how we should be able to speak online, I think we should look more to Congress to delineate what is okay and what is not. I agree completely with Emma that those lanes are narrow, and that we may be concerned in looking to federal criminal law, we may be concerned that that doesn't cover all of our concerns about tech companies and about online speech. But I think that's a sort of an unreasonable bar to set. There are steps that we can take in federal criminal law that are meaningful and valuable, I think. Targeting voter suppression, targeting the use of online tools for offline riots and violence, I think, are two steps that seem reasonable to me. and that I hope we'll be able to pursue in some form. Some of the other things that I proposed were a modified version of the PACT Act, supporting a modified version of the PACT Act, focusing a little bit more on the distinction between hosting online content hosts and content creators. That's the thing that delineates between whether you can use Section 230 as a defense or not. And yet the case that we most rely on in that area is a 2008 case from the Ninth Circuit. I don't think we have sufficient norms for evaluating whether things like algorithmic preferencing, for instance, actually should be considered content creation in a way that would make platforms liable. And then I think we need to do more to provide data transparency so that more people can study issues related to online content and understand in a better way what interventions work and what interventions don't.
So I want to give Emma and Matthew both a chance to respond to Matt's suggestions that he wrote for the Day One project. And I'll start with you, Emma.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of good suggestions there, and would love to unpack them all. One thing I wanted to draw out about, we've been talking about federal criminal law, and just in case folks watching this discussion aren't aware, one of the important things to know about federal criminal law is that it has always applied to online intermediaries. Section 230 has always allowed DOJ to bring federal criminal cases against online intermediaries of any type under existing federal criminal law. So that's been part of the Section 230 framework from the very beginning, and it's part of why, talking about are there missing federal criminal laws that should be created or strengthened, as Matt's talking about, actually isn't even really a conversation about amending Section 230. You don't need to amend Section 230 to do that. And it's important that I think one of the reasons that framework has been sustainable, I guess, over the past 20 plus years that Section 230 has been in place, is that the standards in federal criminal law are typically fairly high, right? An intermediary is not going to face a kind of negligence level claim under federal criminal law. It would typically be charges about knowing and intentional activity to further a crime in some way. And there's a lot more detail that folks could get into about that point too. But I think it's just an important dynamic to understand that federal criminal law is a relatively bounded set of laws versus thinking about like all 50 states and the criminal and civil laws that they may have. And frankly, in the time that Section 230 has been in place, we just haven't seen that many federal criminal cases brought against online intermediaries. There have been some, but it's not something that happens kind of regularly at a really fast pace. So we don't see those same kind of risks that a lot of folks talk about when we think about amending Section 230 broadly and exposing many intermediaries to a whole host of liability. Federal criminal law has been a relatively kind of bounded set. And so that's just a kind of a vote in favor of thinking about those ideas. There are obviously risks to expanding federal criminal law enforcement as well. But it is one way to think about addressing the potential crimes and illegal activity that are happening online, including intermediaries' role in it, without actually changing Section 230 at all.
Yeah, if I could just add, if that's okay. I hope that one day a historian or anthropologist will write a book about how 230 became so dominant in political debates over the last couple of years, because it oftentimes, I think, is introduced in debates where it doesn't really belong. And so on the political right, as Emma alluded to, you have complaints about 230 when what's really going on are complaints about the First Amendment and the right of private companies to disassociate with content that they find objectionable. And to Matt's point, I think oftentimes when there are others discussing 230, what I think they really should be focusing on is, the status of federal criminal law. As Emma mentioned, Section 230 is not a blanket immunity. There are exceptions to it. There's copyright, which we might talk about later, but federal criminal law is certainly one of the exceptions to this, to the law, which is about immunity. And so I do think it's important when people are upset about what they see online, that they realize that Section 230 is not always the law that needs to be brought up. I mean, certainly it's an important law, it's worth discussing, but oftentimes I feel as if it's introduced to discussions where it doesn't belong. And I hope one day someone will unpack exactly how this happened, and especially from the political right, but I do think that's worth keeping in mind.
So in terms of proposals to reform Section 230, though I want this to be a very current sort of focused conversation, I do think it's important for us to look back because Congress has significantly amended Section 230 just a few years ago with FOSTA SESTA, which carved out an exception to Section 230 for sex trafficking law. Emma, I know that CDT has written about FOSTA SESTA before, so I want to ask you first if you think FOSTA SESTA has succeeded or failed in creating a better environment online and what lessons Congress can learn from it and hopefully apply going forward.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think FOSTA SESTA has pretty much only succeeded in creating a really toxic environment online for very vulnerable communities, including the sex worker community in the United States and around the world. The impact of FOSTA SESTA has been kind of really well covered and documented by advocates from the sex worker community, including folks like Kate Diadamo at Reframe Health and Justice. And the folks at Hacking and Hustling, who have some really good reports, really getting into the details of what it has meant for people who are trying to find spaces online to share information about their health, their safety, their well-being. A lot of it speech that is completely lawful and constitutionally protected. But because of the changes that FOSTA SESTA made to Section 230 and to federal criminal law, the risk of potential liability for everything from forums, sites like Reddit, to search engines, to document storage sites, just a huge number of intermediaries became much more concerned about hosting anything that seemed like it might be arm's length from sex work, prostitution, not the child sex trafficking that was the original kind of motivator for the debates around FOSTA SESTA and what had kind of initially led Congress to focus on the issue, but a much, much broader set of activity, including lawful speech, that ended up kind of falling under the ambit of the bill, or at least were kinds of content that intermediaries became very concerned about being associated with. So I think FOSTA SESTA is an important model for Congress to look at as what not to do. There was a bill introduced last session in Congress called the Safe Sex Worker Study Act. It was sponsored by Representative Khanna in the House and Senators Warren and Sanders and Wyden in the Senate. And it would call on HHS to do a study of the actual impacts of FOSTA SESTA on the health and safety of people in the United States in the wake of this loss of online community, loss of online access to information, because it's really important that we understand the unintended consequences and the negative potential effects of the wrong kinds of amendments to 230. These are not hypotheticals. These are not conjectural. They are real things that happen to real people. And if we don't understand how and why and what is it about the changes that FOSTA made to the law that led to this sort of widespread deplatforming of people who are writing and talking about sex and sex work online, then we're not going to be able to avoid those same kind of problems with future bills.
And speaking of future bills, or current bills, I should say, there are a couple of proposals in the current Congress that would amend Section 230, and I want to talk about a couple of them. One of them is Senator Warner's Safe Tech Act, which I think has gotten a lot of attention recently. And any of you can feel free to share your thoughts on this bill specifically and also more broadly on efforts like this that would amend Section 230 by carving out certain types of content or activity from its liability shield. But Emma, I will start with you since you've touched on this. What are the potential unintended consequences of carving out certain types of content and activity from Section 230?
Yeah, well, so in general, I think anytime we're talking about a carve out, we raise one of the fundamental questions that is just pervasive to all kind of online content hosting, content moderation, or being an intermediary of third-party content, which is, what does the intermediary know about the third-party content that they're dealing with? The whole point of Section 230 in the first place was to shield intermediaries from traditional publisher liability, where you would expect, for example, a newspaper running letters to the editor, the newspaper is liable if there's defamation in those letters to the editor, because the newspaper is expected to read all of those letters before they publish them and make an editorial decision about what to publish. Online, it's a totally different situation. There is the scale of user-generated content is so enormous that even for a very small website that has run by one person and gets 100 posts a day, there's no way to do that pre-publication review of all of the content before making an affirmative decision to publish it. So Section 230 sets up a legal framework in which people's speech can be hosted online and made available to other people around the country, around the world, and the intermediary isn't considered liable for having kind of cleared it in some way or decided, yes, I'm pretty confident this is not illegal, I'm going to make this available. A sort of simple explanation, but that's really at the core of it. When we start looking at carve-outs based on different kinds of subject matter, there's often this kind of presumption that, well, the intermediary will be able to find that content amidst the whole, think of it as a needle in a haystack. The intermediary will be able to find the sex trafficking ad or the, whatever other kind of content might be a part of this carve out and treat it differently, treat it with a different set of standards, ensure that they do pre-publication review of that kind of content so that it doesn't get posted while letting all other user-generated content just go ahead. But that's actually not possible to do. That sort of presupposes a kind of pre-publication review that is still technically basically impossible to do, or certainly not possible to do with a level of confidence that most intermediaries are willing to hang a really significant risk of liability on. The use of automation in analyzing mass amounts of content is increasingly common across the internet industry. Certainly the big players like Facebook and Twitter and Google use a lot of automation in their content moderation systems, but these are not magic bullets. These are not magical tools that will reliably find you all and only hate speech or all and only illegal pharmaceutical ads. There's still a lot of error in the systems and a lot of opportunities for these services to make the wrong call, both letting stuff go online that they actually don't want to be hosting, whether it's illegal or just violates their terms, but also so many examples of times when they've said through automation, we're not allowing this content forward and it's something totally innocuous, perfectly lawful, it's something they'd be willing to host. So that's a kind of big picture answer to your question, but that's one of the things I'm always thinking about when I see different potential carve-outs. Does this require the intermediary to be able to pick a particular subset of content, a particular subject matter out of the general mass of user-generated content and treat it differently? Because that's just going to be a fundamental challenge in actually implementing new obligations under the law.
I think, is it okay if I jump in for a second?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks. I think that given the current political situation, any amendment to Section 230 will have to be bipartisan. And the last time Section 230 was successfully amended was, hooked to behavior that is condemned across the political spectrum, which is sex trafficking. And last year we had a bipartisan group of senators introduce the Unintended Act, which is a proposal to tackle the spread of child pornography. And the goal with this kind of legislation is to condition 230 protections on certain behaviors aimed at tackling that kind of that content. And this, of course, concerned many civil libertarians because we view it as a potential attack on encryption. And even if you aren't concerned about the attitudes about the civil libertarians have about encryption, I think this also raises the concern that Matt discussed earlier, which is that of competition, which I do worry that whatever kind of amendment or reform to 230 we have, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world will get onto Capitol Hill and they will help ensure that whatever changes happen, they will be best positioned to comply. And people should remember that Jack Dorsey and Zuckerberg both last year endorsed changes to Section 230, and that's not an accident. And one last thing I'll mention that I also think shouldn't go unnoticed is that there isn't a correlation between how visited a website or interactive computer service is and how many resources they have. We are oftentimes talking about Google and Facebook, which have a huge amount of resources, but websites like Reddit or Wikipedia are very widely visited, but they have nowhere close to the resources that Google or Facebook do. So that's worth keeping in mind as well.
And Matt, do you have any thoughts on Section 230 carve-outs before we move on to the next sort of proposal?
I think Emma and Matthew have both said it very well.
Excellent. So another bill that was reintroduced this year is the See Something, Say Something Online Act, which would require online services to report suspicious transmissions to law enforcement or lose their Section 230 protections. And again, I want to give all three of you a chance to respond to these kinds of proposals that require online platforms to report suspicious activity or suspicious or unlawful content. But I want to start with Matthew because of the Cato Institute's emphasis on civil liberties and freedoms and things like that. What are the potential consequences of this type of requirement for platforms and for consumers?
Right. I should preface my comments by saying that it's been a while since I've taken a look at those proposals. But what I'll say is that we should be prepared, I think, in an environment where there's liability for hosting certain illegal content, or beyond the exception that already exists. We should be prepared for websites to embrace the possibility of false positives, and that's significant, I think, because of the scale of the amount of material we're talking about here. I think it's YouTube, it's something like 500 hours of content uploaded every minute or something like that. The idea that a company of that scale would be able to screen that sort of material in a way that I think advocates of these sort of proposals would like is fanciful. Now, some people might respond and say, well, what's so great about YouTube anyway? That maybe the cost, that we should be willing to incur a certain cost in order to address illegal activity online. But I return to the point I made earlier, which is that it won't just be illegal content that is removed, that there will be many false positives. In the wake of the Foster-Sester Act or package, Craigslist just took down whole sections of their website rather than deal with certain liability. And I think that shouldn't be a surprise, and I think we should expect something similar. And I do think we see when there's very widespread content that causes outrage, even if not illegal in the United States, you still see these websites taking aggressive steps. An example that comes to mind is the video of the shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, which was these attacks on mosques that were live streamed. I believe it was of YouTube that threw AI tools at this issue and said, look, we'll embrace false positives, and anything that even looks like this we'll take down. But if there's legislative mandates, that changes the conversation completely.
And either Emma or Matt, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would say on the kind of the See Something, Say Something Act, very much in agreement with Matthew that it raises real risks of over-reporting. And I'd also note that this isn't the first time we've seen a proposal like this coming up in the US Congress. All the way back in 2015, Senator Feinstein had proposed, I think, what was called the Requiring Reporting of Terrorist Activity Act. And it was that same idea of government wanting tech companies to let government know if they see something suspicious happening on their services. I think the framing of the See Something, Say Something Act is should be an important signal to everyone to think back to, the See Something, Say Something programs that were kind of put in place, especially after 9/11, had a really significant history of totally biased kind of use and impact on people, a really disparate impact on people of color. In the terrorist context in the United States, it typically disproportionately affects Muslims or Arabic speakers. I mean, it's not just that these kinds of laws would be asking tech companies to report on their users to the government as suspected criminals or suspected terrorists. It's that they will almost certainly disproportionately affect already vulnerable communities, and that dynamic is a really important one for Congress to consider very seriously. Adding on kind of more surveillance obligations onto tech companies is going to hurt the same communities who are always more hurt by surveillance in this country.
I think Matthew sorry, Matthew, did you want to go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Matthew and Emma have touched on the key concerns. One that I think is maybe less significant and is certainly dorkier and weedier, but I think is important to keep in mind, is that it's important to remember how companies use Section 230 and when they use it in the litigation process. So they use it at the motion to dismiss phase of litigation in order to avoid discovery, which is the most expensive component of litigation. I've seen some statistics saying it's 90% of litigation costs is discovery. And so being able to use Section 230 as a defense at the motion to dismiss phase avoids those immense costs. Any legislation that involves questions that will need to be litigated, and I think say something as an example of that, but there are others such as good faith or reasonableness standards. Those are things that are going to need to be litigated in the course of litigation, and that means that platforms are going to not be able to kick cases out at the motion to dismiss phase. The result of that is that even in cases that they eventually win, the litigation costs are significantly higher. Again, that's going to disproportionately burden smaller companies, whereas companies like Facebook and Google, for instance, will be able to devote the resources to making it all the way through to a case where they prevail in the end. So Emma was kind of calling out carve-outs as one particular form of reform that she's wary of for really important reasons. I think it's also helpful to be aware of reforms that would shift the procedural posture of how Section 230 is used in a way that is going to significantly increase litigation expenses for platforms.
And now, before we move on to audience questions, I have a question for all three of you, sort of very broad. Where do you think the Section 230 debate is heading in 2021? And I'll just go in alphabetical order and start with Emma.
That's a really good question. I don't see super clear indications of that right now. There are a lot of different ideas being talked about. And I think to point Matthew made earlier, what I'm not seeing yet is any obvious bipartisan coalescing around any particular ideas. One thing I'll call out just as something I think it's really worth taking close looks at and paying attention to, in a number of different bills, including the Warner-Hirono-Klobuchar Safe Tech Act, the Eshoo-Malinowski Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act from last session, and also Representative Clark had circulated a discussion draft about targeted behavioral advertising and civil rights law. We're seeing in all of these different proposals this concept of what about bringing violations of civil rights law outside of the scope of Section 230 protection and ensuring that people who are facing various harms that would be recognizable under civil rights law could actually hold online services liable for the role that they play in them. Like any amendment to Section 230, there's a potential for that to go in a lot of different directions, and some of them very bad. One of the big questions I have right now that I'm still working through with the team at CDT is, what is the whole body of civil rights law referred to by these different proposals? There's some obvious cases and a lot of discussion that's happened in the past couple of years, particularly around this concept of behavioral ad targeting and things like housing credit and employment ads, where the federal statutes are clear about, for example, disparate impact in the targeting of a housing or an employment ad is a violation of federal civil rights law. And there are some really interesting studies, including by the folks over at Upturn, trying to zero in on the particular contributions that, for example, the Facebook ad targeting algorithm may be making. If you can identify that Facebook's ad targeting is the only source of the disparate outcome of showing somebody or a group of people employment ads, there's an interesting question there. Again, maybe that's already outside of Section 230. But so there's that discrete kind of set of federal civil rights laws that deal with things like advertising, where the intermediary liability connection is really clear. But for example, in the Eshoo-Malinowski bill from last session, the civil rights laws that they're looking to are much broader statutes, actually coming, I think, from the 1860s, but all about the just the kind of general violations of people's civil rights, including in things like voter suppression or suppression from participation in public office or execution of public duties, a lot of different things where the connection to what online intermediaries might be doing is not at all clear. But it's something that the drafters of that legislation clearly thought was relevant because that's the carve out that they put into their bill. So I think there's a really important discussion to be had about making sure that the protections that people across the country have under our civil rights laws are enjoyed online and off, absolutely. But I think there's a lot of technical detail to dig into about what laws exactly are we talking about, and what our understanding, as we keep saying, what would really the consequences be of making an exception to Section 230 or eliminating its protection here. What are the kinds of claims and causes of action that would be on the table, and how would that affect the online environment in general?
And I'll go to Matt next. Where do you think the debate on Section 230 is heading?
So my expectation is there would be that the Earn It Act and the PACT Act will both be reintroduced in this Congress, and there would be some movement probably on both of those, in part because I think they're the only major bills that have had bipartisan support. And so I think we could see movement on both of them. I am really worried about the politics on this. I think defending Section 230, as much as we've all tried to do it is difficult. And the narrative on the other side of like, can you believe this crazy, horrible, harmful content that exists on these platforms? We need to do something to combat it. The narrative against it is relatively easy. The defense, I think, is challenging. Even the term intermediary liability sounds like, first of all, it's hard to understand. Second of all, it sounds like just total immunity for large platforms. And why do we care about that? So I think the politics of this are not good, given the importance of the substance of the issue. I think Emma's comments on Sesta Fosta are really important, and we need to bear them in mind, which is this law designed to protect a very vulnerable community had the opposite effect. I think it's likely that there could be political momentum on any number of efforts to reform 230 that would have the exact same kind of dynamic that would really harm communities that we want to be attentive to protecting. So I'm hopeful that there will be sensible efforts at reform. I'm not optimistic. And I guess I should say one reason I'm not optimistic is the number of conversations I feel like I have. It's almost a weekly basis where someone says, oh, there was this recent terrible event in the news about the tech industry. This is the moment when there's going to be real reform, isn't it? Like January 6th or the Australian news law, or leading some voter suppression leading up to the election, or vaccine misinformation, or COVID misinformation. There are just moment after moment after moment where people say, this horrible thing happened and we need to hold tech to account, don't we? That instinct, I think, tends to result in pretty problematic legislative proposals or executive regulation proposals. And I think given where the Democratic Party is, these tensions between the moderate side and the more populist side, and I think a Biden administration that's going to look for opportunities to give the populist part of the party something to chew on, I think it's conceivable that this is the kind of thing that could move in a more extremist, more populist direction pretty quickly. And I think that might be good politically. I don't think it's good for the future of the internet.
And finally, Matthew.
Yeah, I have a really bad track record on making political predictions, so I'm hesitant, but I will say that I agree with Matt that it's likely the Earn It Act will be reintroduced. I think any Section 230 amendment effort is going to have to be hinged on either a category of content that everyone finds objectionable, which I think the Earn It Act does, or behavior from the companies. And there, I just don't see there to be much agreement. It seems to me the right and the left disagree about why they're so critical of these companies. So I don't really see those two concerns stitching together to make a workable legislative package. But something like the Earn It Act, I think, is possible. And ultimately, I return to, I suppose, what I said earlier, which is I hope that when people express concerns about the state of social media or websites more broadly, that they consider how appropriate it is to have Section 230 in the conversation. It's a very popular topic of conversation, but like I mentioned earlier, it's oftentimes, I think, inappropriately placed in debates.
And now let's move on to audience questions. I'm seeing a very interesting one right here that is something we didn't touch on, but very related to topics that we did touch on. So this question asker brings up the EU's Digital Services Act, which I confess I've not read in its entirety. It's very long. But the DSA does do one thing, which is regulate different types of interactive computer services differently. And there are other US proposals that would do this, such as taking a size-based approach to regulation. Do any of you want to comment on this type of proposal that would perhaps impose different regulations or liability standards for larger platforms versus smaller ones?
I'm happy to, well, I haven't read the EU law. So I'll preface by saying that. But we've seen, for example, Senator Josh Hawley made proposals saying, look, once you get to a certain size, certain regulations will kick in. And I think the worry I think people should have there is it's anti-competitive, which is once you say, look, I've written a bill, but it only really applies to the Facebooks and the Googles of the world. The issue you're going to have is once a smaller company gets close to the threshold, the incentive for them to sell to the Googles and the Facebooks becomes bigger and bigger. Once you breach the 100 million visitors a month threshold or whatever it is, if you realize then that a whole new set of laws and regulations are going to kick in, I think that adds an incentive for you to sell the company, and that raises all kinds of competitive concerns.
Oh, Matt, do you want to go ahead? Just so on what's in the DSA, just a quick primer for folks if they haven't looked at it. So the European model for intermediary liability, their e-commerce directive, had always included this breakdown of different kinds of intermediaries sort of based on their function. So you have mere conduits who are just transmitting information, caching providers, and then hosting providers. And in the case law, there's a little bit of a development of an idea of an active host versus a more passive host, but really trying to kind of understand that there are different sorts of things you might expect from kind of core functionality of intermediaries. What the Digital Services Act is bringing in is actually a whole series of kind of graduated regulatory requirements, pretty much based on size, and some on the kind of the function of the service. So there are some regulations that will apply to all intermediaries of any kind, which will include things like search engines and domain name providers, access providers, and hosts. Then there are things focused on just the hosts, and then what I'm not sure if they use the acronym VLOP, but the very large online platform gets its own kind of special category of obligations. And I think intuitively what is somewhat appealing about that model is that there are things, especially I'm thinking in the area of like transparency or due process and how a company makes decisions about content to remove, or the kind of reporting obligations that they might have, or response obligations that they might have when law enforcement sends a court order. There are just things that a large, well-resourced company is more able to do than a small company. And so in Europe, I think what you're really seeing is, rather than the concern about competition that Matthew's been describing, taking a presumption that they will be regulating, and I think that's a fair assumption in Europe, they will be regulating here, and saying, they don't want to discourage small providers by putting really significant, for example, transparency reporting obligations that require a whole team of people that a small provider just doesn't have to collect the information and package it and analyze it, et cetera. And so to start small with regulation, with requirements for things like reporting on smaller companies, but then recognize that the very largest companies are in a different field entirely, are already doing a lot of the things that the regulation is looking for and applying that way. So, I think part of what we're going to be seeing in the next couple of years is a real question about how much difference will we end up with in just transatlantically in our liability frameworks. Are we going to have, the continued sort of bulwark of Section 230 and the First Amendment and very few regulations on online services in the US, and then a very complicated regulatory framework in Europe that applies, a lot of different obligations in a lot of different ways? Or will we see some kind of coming together and a more sort of harmonized approach between both sides of the Atlantic? I think we're not very close to that harmonized approach right now, and I'm not sure that that's particularly of interest to lawmakers on either side of the Atlantic. But as far as thinking about the overall impact on services and how difficult it could end up being, especially for a small service to try to offer its services in both the US and Europe, I would certainly recommend to policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic that they keep an eye on what each other are doing and try not to at least put completely conflicting things into law.
I agree with all that. I think in terms of just thinking about policy development tools and trends, the increasing trend to have an onerous bill and then carve out for small providers, which seems like it's almost, many legislative proposals now feature that element. I think it's really problematic in most circumstances. It sort of ports into non-antitrust context some core principles from antitrust law, which makes sense in antitrust law. Any platform can engage in exclusionary conduct, but not a dominant platform. So we want dominant platforms in the antitrust sphere to behave somewhat differently than we would want non-dominant platforms to behave. And that makes sense. That's the core principle of antitrust law. We don't want monopolies to be able to behave in ways that harm consumers or advertisers. That makes sense. It doesn't seem to me that it makes sense when we talk about the harms of online content. Why do we care if a platform only has 1 million people if it can use if there's content on that platform that can be used to create offline violence in areas like sexual harassment or voter suppression? Why do we care if it's 50,000 people who are harassed or their voting rights are suppressed? We shouldn't immunize platforms that have smaller numbers from those things. We should care about those things across any size platform. And so I think it's problematic for that reason. And it's also problematic because I think it lets policymakers off the hook for doing what is the most challenging work, which is coming up with sensible frameworks that would apply for any type of provider. We don't want providers to bear, any type of provider, including the largest ones, to take resources away from investing in innovation and investing in developing better and better products and put them into onerous bureaucratic requirements that don't have much value. We don't want that for large platforms. We don't want that for small ones. We should figure out things that we can do that actually can be applied across platforms. As Emma said at the outset, thinking about federal criminal law, there are a lot of reasons why federal criminal law is a sensible tool, including that you would apply it uniformly no matter what the platform is. We don't want any platform to violate federal criminal law, and federal criminal law is narrowly tailored usually to address very specific problems in specific ways that minimize burdens even on smaller platforms.
Another audience question. This one's from Robbie Westover. How does the fact that these platforms promote user-generated content affect the Section 230 debate? So I think this question is dealing with sort of algorithms that many social media and other online platforms have that promote speech that certain users make. Should this or does this impact their liability? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I will just say that Section 230 does not immunize a platform from its own speech, right? So if YouTube decides to promote a video and say, this is the best video of the month, and we urge you all to watch it, and then it turns out that video includes illegal content or something similar, that it's possible, right, that you could sue YouTube for their own speech in promotion. I'm not sure what that litigation would look like exactly, but I do think it's important for people to keep in mind that when Twitter, when Facebook, when YouTube speak, they can be held liable for that. And that can apply in promotion. I'll also mention, Section 230 C2A, if you want to get technical, does say that that there's a shield for liability when it comes to certain behaviors like spell check or automated screening and things like that. But I think it is worth keeping in mind that these platforms are responsible for their own speech. Algorithms raise a whole different category of concerns I haven't thought too strongly about, because I'm not sure if there's actually been litigation trying to hold a platform accountable for a specific kind of speech that's been promoted via algorithm. But I could be wrong about that. It's an interesting question.
Another question that gets at more of the basics of Section 230. What is the risk to user liability if Section 230 is repealed? Can I get in trouble for liking or sharing an untrue Facebook post?
If Section 230 is repealed, there's not going to be any opportunity for any users to comment or share content. So I think the user won't have to worry about it. I mean, the important thing to remember is that Section 230 is not an across-the-board liability shield. It shields hosts of content, not creators of content. So user liability, you would be liable for things that you do that are unlawful. As Emma said at the outset, the First Amendment means that you can engage in lots of types of speech that's not without it being unlawful. You know, the scope of criminal law related to speech is narrow because of the First Amendment. But if you were to engage right now in unlawful activity on Facebook or Google, you would be liable. The only question that Section 230 raises is whether the host is also liable.
Well, and but to add to that, I think what this question might be getting at is sometimes it's overlooked, but part of those 26 words in 230C1 that Jeff Kosseff took the title of his great book from is that 230 shields both the providers and users of interactive computer services from liability for third-party content. So a good example to think about might be currently, like if I'm on Tumblr and I see a defamatory post or a post that might be defamation and I reblog it, I put it on my own blog, but somebody else wrote it. Section 230 shields Tumblr for any potential defamation claim there, but it would also shield me as the user of that computer service who's reblogging, reposting, publishing, linking to someone else's potentially illegal content. So that is something that is at stake especially in the conversations about kind of broad-based repeals of 230. I think Matt's exactly right that if there's a broad-based repeal of 230, there's not going to be a lot of user-generated content for any of us to reblog and maybe wind up crosswise about. But it's crucial to recognize that it's not just the technical intermediary who's interacting with third-party content, with someone else's speech. It's all of us when we link to things, when we quote them, especially when we screenshot them and then want to comment about them on some other website somewhere to denounce every terrible thing that other person said. There's a lot of kind of remix of user-generated content that happens just in the basic ways that we use social media. And currently, we all benefit from Section 230's protection for if any of that happens to break the law.
I think that last point that Emma made is also just really critical, which is I think people often think of problematic content being reshared to celebrate it, which it certainly is, but it's also reshared to denounce it. And so protecting immunity in the ways that Emma was just describing is really important for people who want to condemn certain content that they see online. And just to be clear, most people, when they're posting ideas online, they're not only posting them online, they still believe them or they distribute them in some form in their offline world. So having it visible online with an opportunity to condemn it, I think is a really important feature of user-generated content platforms that might be lost with certain reforms.
And there are a couple questions in here that deal with misinformation or disinformation that I'm going to sort of combine into one since we don't have that much time left. One of them is specifically for you, Matt Perot, that's about your federal criminal law proposals. Would the proposal that you're making make voter misinformation illegal online, or how would that be accomplished?
Yeah, so deceptive practices in voting, currently there are prohibitions at the state level. There aren't prohibitions at the federal level. So the kind of core thrust of my proposal was to kind of use best elements of the law at the state level and pass a federal criminal law in that area. I am not the First Amendment expert that Emma and others are, so I'm not the right person to design exactly what that law would look like. What I called for in the paper would be a series of workshops likely led by the Justice Department in consultation with state attorneys general and election law experts to figure out what the scope of the law is. Again, it wouldn't solve voter suppression, but what I think even a narrow law would target behavior that we think is problematic. We generally, one of the rationale for criminal law is that it deters behavior that we think is problematic. I think the other thing that's really important is it would set up an ecosystem of collaboration between platforms and law enforcement to help fight voter suppression. So right now, the FBI isn't able to make requests to companies like Facebook and Google for information about people who are suppressing voting because there's no underlying violation of federal law that can be the basis of an FBI inquiry. A law enforcement regime that would be set up to help address voter suppression, I think, would result in less voter suppression in the world, even in cases where it doesn't necessarily make platforms liable themselves.
And then,
can I just chime in on that? As when we're thinking about disinformation, it's also so important to think about the many different kinds of content that can be disinformation. And so when we think about political or electoral disinformation, it's everything from like false information about candidate endorsements along the lines of Pope endorses Trump, and those sorts of headlines, to like inaccurate information about what a candidate's positions are or what they're for, all the way down to a much more kind of concrete subset of information, like inaccurate information about where and how to vote. What is what is your polling place? What dates are the elections? When is your deadline for requesting a mail-in ballot? Things like that. We saw that as a big site of misinformation and voter suppression campaigns during this most recent election. And CDT worked with a variety of groups, including Center for Tech and Civic Life, to try to actually get elections officials to participate more online, to be authoritative sources of information about that very specific category of potential disinformation, that information about where and how to vote. So if we were thinking, as Matt's suggesting, along the lines of like what kind of federal law could really be responsive to online voter suppression, I would definitely recommend looking in that kind of very specific, precise category, especially of information where there is a factual answer as to what is true and what is false. It's not in the area of opinion. It's not in the area of political expression. It is dates and times and procedures, and there is a real answer in law about that. That's the kind of zeroing in on a specific issue. We don't solve all problems of disinformation by looking at that narrow category, but we probably solve some really important problems without the many, many unintended consequences of a much broader and more sweeping law.
Excellent. That was actually exactly sort of what I was going to ask more detail about. So we are unfortunately out of time today. I think there is a lot more to discuss about Section 230 and about the related issues surrounding political speech. So hopefully you will all continue to tune in to what ITIF is saying and to what our three experts here are saying and what their organizations are saying. I want to thank all three of you for joining me today. I think this was a really great discussion, and I want to thank our audience for tuning in. Just a quick reminder, if you want to learn more about Section 230 and hear from other experts, you should subscribe to Elise and Ashley Break the Internet, which you can find on all major podcast platforms and our website at itif.org/230pod. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to touching base and discussing more about Section 230 in the future.